Welcome to the WanderLearn Show. I'm your host, Tapon. This is the third and final episode with Dr. Robert Edwards, and we talk about D.B. Cooper. This is the episode you all been waiting for, the final episode, which is talking about whatever happened to D.B. Cooper, the money, why was it found, and who was D.B. Cooper? Did he have a military background? What kind of plausible explanation could we have for what happened that night when D.B. Cooper jumped out of that airplane? Did he survive? We dive into this fascinating discussion with Dr. Robert Edwards, who is the author of D.B. Cooper and Flight 305. Enjoy this podcast and enjoy the new year. Welcome to the WanderLearn Show. I'm your host, Tapon. I'm here once again with Dr. Robert Edwards. He is the author of D.B. Cooper and Flight 305. And this is an outstanding book that covers the D.B. Cooper mystery, which, real quick summary, a man hijacked in 1971, I believe, that took a plane, asked for $200,000, which was a lot of money back then. Well, it's a lot of money now, too. And then jumped off the plane with a bunch of parachute, well, at least one parachute that he was wearing, and presumably, and the $200,000 disappeared, never heard of again. The money was never traced except for $5,800. So we're going to get very quickly into the Tena Bar, which is the place where this money was found by a little child. A part of the money, the $5,800, which is of the $200,000 total. But before that, let's do a little speculation, shall we? And talk a little bit about what D.B. Cooper might have been like and a little bit more of his background and personality. So I'll send it over to you, Doctor. What do you think a little bit, what's your best guess of some of his notable background that you might find noteworthy?
Thank you, Francis. Well, I think, first of all, let me say that I have never wanted to get involved in speculation about the identity of the hijacker, which I do feel is a lost cause. And an unnecessary expensive time and effort given the data that we possess today. But as I said, I do think that we can say something intelligent about the prior life experience of the hijacker from various testimony as to what he did and what he said. We know a little bit about the knowledge that he possessed. And maybe more importantly, we know a little bit about the limits of his knowledge. So first of all, we know here's a male, to all appearances, a U.S. citizen, American, who speaks perfect American English without any accent that anyone can detect, who is about 5'10" to 6'2", relatively thin for his height, something like 170, 180 pounds, who has no particular distinguishing features, a very nondescript man, a person that you would pass in the street and never remember.
He was wearing sunglasses, right?
He put on sunglasses early in the flight. Very briefly, two of the cabin crew saw him without sunglasses, but probably within a few minutes of passing the ransom note, he put on those shades and never removed them in any subsequent part of the flight. So his features were never very clearly seen, except perhaps by the first cabin crew who received the note. And that's another story which I think we don't have time to get into
the book
today.
To do that analysis. Buy the book.
Yes, okay. There are many stories.
And the link will be in the show notes for those who are looking to buy the book. It's a great book. Really covers in excruciating detail every little nook and cranny. There's no stone that's left unturned. You really did a fantastic job of really diving deep. We're just skimming the surface in this podcast. So continue.
We are indeed, Francis. There are more stories than we can tell today. But to return to the hijacker, what kind of person was he? Um, I said earlier in your show that I was very much convinced that he had prior parachuting experience. His preternatural calm in a very tense and dangerous situation told me that he was a person accustomed to, let's say, high risk situations. His comfort with the parachute and the ease with which he put it on, the fact that he declined instructions on how to put it on, told me that without any real doubt that he had parachuting experience. Now, taking it from there, we should ask, from where would he have had such experience? Clearly, the military comes to mind. One would start thinking paratrooper. There are some problems with that. If this man was about 45, as most witnesses, let's say that's the, if you like, the center point of the witness estimates, he is somewhat too young to be World War II. A little bit too young, unless he served way at the end of the war. And certainly World War II was the last major war in which the US deployed airborne troops on any significant scale. But as I say, he's kind of too young. Now, you take Vietnam, he's too old. Vietnam was a young man's war, and here's a man of 45. It's very difficult to believe he could have served in Vietnam. And plus, although I'm not a military historian or anything approaching it, to my understanding, insertions in Vietnam were done by helicopter, not by parachute. So it leaves as kind of by elimination that if he had combat experience, it most likely would have been Korea. Again, Korea is a little bit difficult to think about because, again, Korea, the US had largely stopped doing airborne operations by the time of Korea. There were some airborne insertions in Korea, but very, very few.
But there's constantly training for these missions, even in peacetime operations. The U.S. military is training and new airborne people all the time. So why couldn't he just been one of the many recruits that was trained either to be airborne?
Yes, I think that's a fair question. And I would kind of answer in the affirmative. I would say that he had jump training.
Right.
Um,
Navy SEALs,
and
anybody in special operations in the U.S. military. I mean, granted, that's pretty elite, but Army Rangers, all these guys, they often get their airborne pin, and they may never see any battle ever.
Well, there is, and of course, there has been a great deal of discussion and also proposals of suspects, or let's say suggestions that the hijacker was ex-SEALs or ex-Halo jumpers, ex-Special Ops. To my mind, that's overqualified.
Right.
That's too high of a level of skill for this hijacker. I think this hijacker is a guy that has had training, has probably done some jumps,
At night.
probably not a lot, maybe has done jumps in Korea. But my feeling, weighing the probabilities, was that he had been more likely in the US Air Force than in the US Army. And I would think that he had been in something like what is now called a loadmaster position, which is essentially, they also call them kickers. These are the guys who essentially secure cargo for drops, prepare cargo for drops, take care of weight and balance on the airplane, and assure safe departure of the cargo in airdrops. And loadmasters do need to have jump training. They don't necessarily do live jumps. They may do simply jump training on a zip line, for example, but they know how to put on a parachute. They know how to deploy the parachute. Loadmaster for me is a very interesting possible occupation, but it's not necessarily the only one. I don't see the hijacker as a former paratrooper for the reasons I just said. Airborne operations had pretty much ceased by this time. And secondly, now we turn to his knowledge. He clearly had some knowledge of the configuration of an airplane. That's to say, he specified to the crew to fly with gear down and to fly with flaps at 15 degrees. That's very specific. It's not the kind of knowledge which a paratrooper would possess, because paratroopers do not need that knowledge. Paratrooper's job begins when he hits the ground. He doesn't need to know what's happening with the airplane. He needs to get out, he needs to land. The loadmaster, by contrast, does need to know the configuration of the airplane. So gear and flap settings are the kind of knowledge that a loadmaster would possess, much more likely than a paratrooper. So I see the hijacker as, if I had to name one single occupation that he had prior to this event, it would be loadmaster, US Air Force, and probably for his age, some exposure to Korea, if only to account for his calm in a high stress situation. It seems to me that his calm, his composure, implied some kind of combat or frontline experience. That's probably all that I can say at this point. I see him as a person with, to summarize, with jumping experience, probably some military experience, more likely Air Force than Army, and probably the experience consisting of not a lot of jumps, but enough to be completely comfortable with the rig. And one point I forgot to mention is, and I think this is quite important, he asked for 4 parachutes, 2 back, 2 front. The 2 backpacks are main chutes. The 2 front are reserves. The 2 parachutes, the 2 main chutes he reserved, one was a Navy backpack, NB6. The other was what the FBI called, a civilian luxury model. Very different looking from the military chute. It had a tan canvas cover, a very nice looking rig. And he chose the military rig over the civilian rig. That, for me, tells something about rigs he was used to. He was comfortable with the Navy Backpack 6. He didn't much care for the much nicer looking, much more comfortable, much more easy opening civilian rig. So that tells me military, possibly Navy, but there was a lot of commonality between Navy and other services rigs. So I would say the familiarity with the rig tells me military.
Yeah, I think you've got some compelling evidence there to back that claim up. By the way, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but for those who are just seeing this episode, there are 2 other episodes I've recorded regarding DB Cooper and this whole hijacking story and the mystery that has never been solved. Go to the show notes as well as the upper right-hand corner to catch the earlier videos that I did with Dr. Edwards about the same subject, and we covered other topics. But what I want to move to now is the crux of the thing, the discovery, roughly 20 years later, you'll correct me with the exact date of when this little child found it on the Tena Bar, which is a kind of a sandy section next to a river. And he uncovered $5,800 of the $200,000 that were originally stolen by DB Cooper. So roughly, let's just call it 3% of the total. So 3% of the 200,000 was recovered. Nobody knows whatever happened to the other 97%. Did it also fall in the water? Did DB Cooper spend it? Did DB Cooper die? Did he, his body was never found. Uh, all sorts of other questions that we got to address. So let's start with the Tena Bar place. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, Francis, as you say, Tena Bar is kind of the crux of the story. It's kind of the punchline, and more than any other single element of the story, it gives us some kind of direction as to how we reconstruct what happened on that day. As you say, a young child, he was in fact 8 years old, was on a picnic with his parents and his, I think, sister or cousin on the banks of the Columbia River. And this is at river mile 97, as measured from the mouth of the Columbia, from the estuary. It's on the Washington side, that's to say the eastern
North.
side, as the river is flowing at that point. And it's something like, I would say, it's probably, I forget exactly, 6 or 10 miles downstream from the Interstate 5 bridge at Portland, Vancouver. And as you say correctly, he found a few inches below the sand. And this was on February the 10th, 1980. So it was, I'll correct you if I may, it was about 8 years after the hijacking, just over 8 years. Looking for firewood for the picnic fire, he dug into the sand, and here he found these 3 bundles of very much degraded, but clearly identifiable US $20 bills. And of course, the rest of it is history. But
The serial numbers, just for those who don't know, the serial numbers on those dollar bills match the ones of the serial numbers that were given to DB Cooper as part of the $200,000 ransom.
That's correct. Every serial number was definitively identified as part of the ransom which had been given to the hijacker on November 24th, 1971. So no question this came from the hijacking.
Right.
Now, the imponderables that came up at this point really engendered a cloud of contradictory and to some extent tortured theories about how the money could have got there. Because Tena Bar is nowhere near the flight path. It is something like, from memory, about 15 miles west of the flight path. And if you accept the flight path within certain approximations, let's say plus or minus 1 mile, which is quite happy for me, I'm quite happy to accept that. This is 15 miles outside, and furthermore, it's 15 miles upwind. In other words, there's no possibility realistically for the hijacker to have landed at Tena Bar. There's no way that you, as a jumper under a non-steerable canopy with a wind blowing from the southwest, as it was that night, could travel towards the southwest, upwind. It cannot be done. It's just simply impossible.
It reminds me of the axe for the George Mallory. Go see that video.
Yes.
That defies the laws of physics.
How could the axe have got there? Yes, indeed. Well, we covered that in another story.
Right.
So,
But
yeah,
yes.
here we have a kind of inexplicable set of bundles of money from the hijacking on a place some 15 miles upwind from the flight path where the hijacker could not have landed. So how could the money have got there? Especially since at that time the prevailing narrative was that the hijacker had landed near Ariel, Washington on the Lewis River. And if you wanted to conjecture that that was true and that somehow he lost the money and the money traveled down the Lewis River, you have a grave problem because the Lewis River joins the Columbia downstream of Tena Bar. And now you need the money to go upstream to get to Tena Bar. It cannot be done. That narrative, to my astonishment, has appeared on the FBI's own website. And I'm baffled by that.
So
I don't see any way that any floating object can travel upstream except by some, you really have to be creative to think of a mechanism.
right. Now, the conspiracy theorists will come up with all sorts of creative explanations, but what is your best case explanation? You go through a lot of different possibilities in your book. But
Okay,
what would you say is, just tease us with what you think is a plausible story to explain how the money ended up there.
okay. Well, I will try to do more than tease you because, as you say, I've thought about this long and hard and examined what I would consider reasonable possibilities and probabilities. And as you know, um, I like to be guided by what they call Occam's razor, the principle of the English medieval priest William of Ockham, who proposed, and I think it still holds true today, that a simple explanation is better than a complex one. Now, for me, the existence of money at Tena Bar, if I wanted to think about human agency, for example, that the hijacker buried it there, or that an accomplice of the hijacker buried it there, or that somebody found it somewhere else in Washington state and carried it there and put it there. All of these are conjectures or narratives involving human agency, and for me, this is complex. And I prefer what for me is the simplest explanation is that the money arrived by the mechanism of the water, by the Columbia River. There are narratives to the effect that water cannot float. I've looked up the US Treasury. I've calculated the weight, the dimensions, the thickness of a US dollar bill. And according to my calculations, a US dollar bill, and I think a $20 bill also, is lighter than water by a couple of a percent. Therefore, a dry dollar bill will float. Furthermore, even a waterlogged dollar bill or $20 bill will float because however much water goes into the pores of the bill, the material of the bill is still lighter than water. Well, ultimately, I think in the 70s, US currency was already made of a mixture of fibers and plastics.
Mm.
I'm not sure the exact composition, but I do know that it was lighter than water.
Mm.
Furthermore, if you were to conjecture that the dollar bills, and here don't forget there were three bundles of dollar bills, not obviously attached to each other, for them to arrive at Tena Bar adjacent to each other requires almost certainly a container of some kind. Because three bundles of bills separated from each other are not going to converge and arrive in the same place. So three bundles together, each of them with a rubber band around it or several rubber bands, but all in the same place, presupposes a container. And we know that the hijacker had access to at least three containers. Number one, the bank bag in which he received the money, a canvas bag with wooden handles, a rather heavy and bulky bag, was never seen again. It's conceivable he used that bag as a container for the money. That's one possibility. Number two, we know that one of the chest parachutes that were supplied to him was never seen again. He left one on the plane, the other disappeared. He could not have jumped with it because it was not an operating chute, and he probably would have seen that immediately. So he might have simply thrown away the canopy out of the back and used the container to put the money in, attaching it to him with rope, string, whatever he could. The third possibility is that it was seen by witnesses that he had on his person, or he was carrying something resembling a plastic shopping bag of the kind that you used to buy men's shirts in. It would give you a fairly sturdy paper and plastic bag of about 18 inches by 10, that kind of thing. So there were several containers available to the hijacker in which he could put the money. Any one of these containers could have served as some kind of buoyant mechanism whereby three bundles of $20 bills could stay together long enough to arrive at a beach where the three bundles wash up on the shore, the container disintegrates, 8 years pass, water laps on the beach, sand covers the bills, and you have your story. So for me, to recap, the simplest narrative is that the money arrived by the natural mechanism of water without any human agency whatsoever. And to take that story further, we would have to say, well, okay, where was it before Tena Bar?
Right. It must have come from a
Now,
tributary that fed into the Columbia River, obviously.
Not necessarily, no. It could have arrived, its first arrival in the Columbia River could have been in the Columbia River itself,
Correct.
upstream from
Absolutely.
Tena Bar, because
Right.
we know for certain that Flight 305 crossed the Columbia about a mile east of the interstate bridge, and it took about 20 seconds to cross the Columbia at that speed. Columbia is about a mile wide at that point. And if the money arrived in the Columbia, then it's got a few miles to travel downstream to Tena Bar, and it's got 8 years to do it. So whether it travels on that same night, whether it gets stuck in a snag, whether it takes its time, rolls along the bottom, we've got 8 years for the money to arrive at Tena Bar. That's one mechanism. Second, as you say, there are tributaries of the Columbia. And the most obvious, and for me the most interesting, is the Willamette, which is it's the main river of the Willamette Valley that runs north-south through Oregon and passes through Eugene, Salem, Portland, and eventually enters the Columbia. And one of the reasons I like the Willamette, by the way, I learned how to pronounce Willamette from a person, a lady from Oregon.
Okay.
I was calling it Willamette.
Right.
She says, no, it's Willamette.
Right.
Sorry, it's Willamette. Okay, now the Willamette enters the Columbia just a little bit downstream from the Interstate 5 bridge. And when it enters, it's quite a substantial river. It's sending a lot of flow into the Columbia, and the flow is driving the water in a northeast direction. Now, for me, if, let's say, we just run with this idea that the money came from the Willamette, when it reaches the junction with the Columbia, the force of the Willamette is going to push it over to the eastern side of the Columbia. And for me, I'm not a hydrologist by any means, and there's going to be people that will tell me, no, this can't be done. But until such time, I see a very natural means for floating money in a container, whatever, to arrive from the Willamette to the Columbia and then to drift over to the eastern bank, where probably Tena Bar is the first natural beach for the money to arrive. So if you like, that's plan B. If not the Columbia, then the Willamette. And there's more. And I refer you to the book, but Willamette has tributaries also. And there's ways for the money to arrive in the Willamette from a tributary or from a lake. And maybe at the end of this, of our conversation today, if we have time, I'd like to share with your audience some places to go and have a look.
We might want to do that right now. We've got about 5 minutes remaining. So I kind of want to talk about what's your best plausible theory of whether he lived or died. Because, and by now he would be assuming that he was like in his around 40 years old. He might be, 90 or whatever his age. He could have died a natural death, but he could have died that very same night. His body was never found. So there's a lot of questions that people have. Now, again, go by the book, find out a lot more detail there. But in 5 minutes, let's hit some of the key points that most people ask, which is what happened to D.B. Cooper? Do you think he lived or died that night?
Okay, well, that is a very tough question because there is no evidence that he either lived or died. I'm tempted, or if you like, I like the narrative that he lived.
He is an
That,
anti-hero that a lot of people kind of almost celebrate. He's almost like a celebrated countercultural figure that people have, and so a lot of people like that narrative as well.
well, no, I don't say that, because in any way I admire him.
Mm.
He was clearly a very motivated, mission-capable man, but he committed a crime, and it's nothing to be admired. But I suppose, if you like, my personal reason for liking the narrative that he is alive is because I would like him to call me up and to say, Bob, I'm 95 years old now. I read your book. This is what you got right. This is what you got wrong.
That
That's
would,
all. I just like him to call me up.
I would love that call too.
Okay, but
So you would like it, but you admit that it may not be possible. What do you think happened to the rest of the money?
okay, I think it's quite likely that the hijacker lost all the money. If you accept, which I do, that the money arrived in Tena Bar by natural means, I don't much like the idea of him burying money as a decoy,
Mm.
make people think he died. It's not something you can prove or disprove, but it seems to me if you find some money, then there's some more money somewhere else. In other words, there could be more money somewhere along the Columbia. There's 97 miles from Tena Bar to the estuary. There could be some beach on which there's more money. Uh, could be on the eastern side, could be on the western side. I have no way of saying.
Mm.
It could have all drifted down to the Pacific and it's gone forever. Um, it's possible that some part of the money could still be somewhere in the Columbia or the Willamette, but it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where if some of the money has arrived at Tena Bar, then the rest of the money must have passed Tena Bar and gone somewhere else. So my best guess would be lower reaches of the Columbia below Tena Bar. It's 97 miles, but if anybody wanted to have an adventure, a Cooper treasure hunt, that's where I would tell them to go.
Any other last minute tips of places around Tena Bar you're suggesting if somebody wants to wander and learn and kick over a few stones and dig a little bit anywhere
Yeah,
else?
not Tena Bar itself. That's
Mm.
been covered, but
Mm.
downstream from Tena Bar.
Got it.
Okay, last minute
Hmm.
suggestions. I would invite your wander learners to go to Battleground, Washington. Go to a place about 2 miles southwest of Battleground downtown, and find an FAA beacon. It's called the Battleground Vortac. It kind of looks like a flying saucer. There's a picture of it in my book. There's an address in my book. This would be your starting point to find the briefcase in which the hijacker carried the supposed bomb. My guess is that some fragments of that briefcase are somewhere on a tract of land starting from Battleground and going somewhere north a few miles. Interesting adventure. Last but not least, for your wander learners, I advise them to go to a place called Oswego Lake. There's a town called Lake Oswego. It's on a lake called Oswego Lake. The lake is entirely private. It's all surrounded by private property. I think it's quite possible, for reasons that I probably don't have time to explain in what time we have left, that the hijacker might have landed in Oswego Lake.
And you
Whether he
definitely
lived,
you talked about that in the book.
I talked about it in the book. Oswego Lakes is drained every few years or so. The water level is drained down, but is never completely emptied. The water which is ejected from Oswego Lake goes through a little creek called Oswego Creek, which leads to the Willamette, which leads to the Columbia. That would be a good hunting ground for your wander learners to just Stick around.
Get a scuba suit and a light and have at it.
Yeah. Why not?
Excellent. Well, Robert, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. I love
Thank
your
you.
style of investigation. You just stick with the facts and you probe meticulously. So get this book for those who want to dive into the D.B. Cooper mystery. Robert Edwards is the author of the book, and the book is called D.B. Cooper and Flight 305. I'll put it in the show notes. And I'll also put the things that you mentioned, the sites to go poke around and kick around and wandering and learning. I'll put that in the show notes as well, Dr. Edwards.
Okay, great. I think it'll be fun for your viewers.
Okay,
Adventure.
thank you. And
Okay.
last thing, I'll give you a tease for the future. We will talk about your third book that we haven't talked about. Yes, the
Voynich
manuscript. That's a tease
Get
of a
ready.
future episode. Yes.
Get ready to be baffled.
If you think D.B. Cooper baffles you, if you think George Mallory, and Irving mystery baffled you, this one takes
You
the
ain't
cake.
seen nothing yet.
All right, take care.
And that ends this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we've talked about, go to wanderlearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember Tapon. That's my first initial and my last name. Tapon is always my social media username. My website is ftapon.com. Do you want to leave me an anonymous voicemail where you can make a comment or ask a question? Then go to speakpipe.com/ftapon. Furthermore, if you'd like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. Now, 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at wanderlearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.